For those who don't know me, my name is Ev, and I want to talk to y'all about punk. Now, obviously, everything that I'm going to say is incredibly watered down. There's no way that I could talk about everything that was going on in the punk scene in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and onward with any level of detail without this being 100 hours long. But given what's happening on the internet right now, I thought that it would be kind of a good little introduction for folks as to what punk is, why punk exists in the way it does, what has happened to punk over the last, 30 or 40 years, and what makes a good punk artist, if such a thing could ever exist. So the first thing that I want to talk about is punk that came out of London in the 70s and 80s. And this punk was categorized by one big thing in particular, and it does relate to the Tramp Stamps and to the things that are going on with that group right now. And it's the DIY or the do-it-yourself aspect of the punk scene. Obviously, when you have a new subculture that's just starting out, you're not going to be able to walk into a Target and buy a leather jacket covered in safety pins. So this DIY aspect, it's something that other subcultures have engaged with as well, but it was especially prevalent for the punk movement because the anti-consumerist and anti-capitalist message of punk really inspired this sort of DIY aesthetic. And that's why you'll see pictures of punks from the 70s and 80s rocking the leather jackets with the safety pins or the homemade patches, the homemade buttons. You couldn't access punk in a store. The whole point of the entire aesthetic and the entire culture and the social movement of punk was that these are things that you had to do yourself. And the second aspect of that was that it did not have to look good. In fact, it was better if it didn't look good. So you have this subculture that's emerging out of pubs in London in the 70s and 80s. And you've got this group of people designing their own clothing, designing their own culture, essentially. And with the birth of a new subculture, you do have people saying, what do we want this subculture to look like? Who do we want to represent? And in the case of punk, that was very, very, very clear. In the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of things going on in the UK, in North America as well, but I'll get to that in a minute. You had racial tensions going on with groups like the National Front. You had police and black youth clashing. I wonder what that must be like. And you had football riots. We see a little bit of that in North America nowadays, or, maybe in the last 10 years or so when a sports team wins a game or loses a game, you have that outpouring of people onto the streets. And it was no different in the UK in the 70s or 80s. And you had these cultural moments as well, of high unemployment, low economic stability. A lot of people were unemployed, broke. It was really a time of economic scarcity, I guess, when it comes to wealth. And so these were kind of the factors that influenced the growth of the punk movement. And that's why you kind of got this counterculture of people being like, the status quo is not okay. It is not serving us. It is not serving our country's most vulnerable people. And so we are going to create a space in which those people are free to exist as they are and as they'd like to be. And that's why you saw a lot of people of color starting punk bands, a lot of fat people in punk bands, a lot of people with, pockmarked skin, acne scars, crooked teeth, broken teeth, things that aren't conventionally attractive because the punk movement celebrated these things in a way that mainstream society did not. And I don't want to paint a kind of rose-colored glasses, look at the punk scene, obviously there was white supremacy, obviously there was body shaming, obviously there was homophobia and transphobia, these things that existed in, let's call it the parent culture or mainstream culture, bled into the punk scene as they do in every counterculture. You're never going to see a counterculture where racism and homophobia and these things just do not exist. There will always be people with those values trying to, you know, exist in these spaces. So I do want to kind of add that disclaimer that it was by no means a perfect movement. But back to the kind of DIY aspect of it, there were kind of things going on behind the scenes as the punk movement grew. Essentially, the parent culture, the mainstream culture started looking at punk and saying, hey, this is something we can make money off of. And so I might get in trouble for kind of saying her name in this way, but you had artists like Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren and the Sex Pistols, where, you know, they're starting to gain this kind of mainstream notoriety. And with this, there's profit involved in that, right? As soon as you take a subculture and you make it have mainstream appeal, there's a lot of money to be made there. And so unfortunately, you did have some unscrupulous characters who saw this movement and wanted to capitalize on it. And the reason that I kind of discuss this history of punk as we're talking about the Tramp Stamps is because it is so relevant. The Tramp Stamps represent everything that the punk scene never wanted to be. They never wanted to be commercialized. They didn't want to be able to be commercialized. They did not want people profiting off of this subculture to the point that they have. Again, the mall goths are going to come for me, but you look at things like Hot Topic. Hot Topic has perfected the art of monetizing subculture and profiting off of subculture. And I think that when we look at a subculture that has explicitly anti-capitalist values, we see the harm that comes from that because it directly contradicts what the ethos of that subculture is. And when it comes to the Tramp Stamps, unfortunately, they don't really seem to understand the roots of the movement. And we see this in a number of ways. One of their comments, I believe it was in an interview, said that nobody has done what they are doing. And what they're doing, for those of you who don't really know, is they kind of have this baby's first white feminism image. They're using buzzwords and kind of ideas that were very popular on Tumblr, maybe in the early 2010s. We're talking like maybe 2010 to 2014. And for the most part, these are ideas that are within kind of this alternative subculture are pretty well known already. For example, their label is called Make Tampons Free. I don't think you're going to find anyone who values themselves as, let's call them a counterculture member, especially in these kind of left-leaning punk circles who are going to argue that tampons shouldn't be free. In fact, it's a pretty milquetoast kind of neoliberal spin. You know, punk is anti-capitalist at its core, so something like Make Tampons Free is just such a weak stance from a punk perspective. You know, punks talked about abolishing the state, about revolution, about, you know, dismantling capitalism, about dismantling the police, about, you know, punching Nazis in the face. These are, you know, strong stances to take, and I just really don't see the Tramp Stamps espousing any of those ideals. You know, they're kind of treading the middle ground of we want to come off as edgy, but we don't really want to take a firm stance on anything significant. And you can see that in their lyrics as well. When you look at songs like I'd Rather Die, we all know the lyric at this point. It's I'd rather die than sleep with another straight white guy. And, you know, at least one of them is married to a straight white guy, which I gotta say, I feel bad for that guy. It must be horrible to be in a relationship where your wife is making a living off of talking about how much she doesn't want to fuck you. That is just not great in my eyes. So, where do we go from here? How do we move past groups like the Tramp Stamps to kind of examine what we want the punk movement to look like in the future? And I think there's not really a good answer for that, not because it doesn't exist, but because people are already doing it. Fat, queer, trans, people of color, people who have historically been marginalized in society have already been doing this work far, far better than the Tramp Stamps ever could. And I don't think that we really need to, we don't really need to recreate this subculture when it already exists. We can bring attention to the artists who genuinely deserve recognition. We can amplify voices that have historically not been heard to give them a platform to, speak their truth and spread their message, and stop listening to groups like the Tramp Stamps, whose entire image is about making money. Their entire image goes against what punk is supposed to be. And it's frankly insulting to the decades and the generations of real punks who have come before them. They don't know their history. They don't know their roots. They have no understanding of the movement that came before them. They are purely using it as a surface level facade to generate profit. And that's my beef with them. I know that some people have compared the hate and backlash that the Tramp Stamps have been getting to Rebecca Black, and I just want to completely dispel that right now. Rebecca Black was an exploited 13-year-old who wanted to make music with her friends and was relentlessly mocked for it. These are women who are like pushing 30. These are adult women who should know better and are doing this of their own free will, and they're doing it to make money. Their motivations are completely different, and their situations are completely different. And for those who are mocking the Tramp Stamps, obviously, if they're body shaming or being sexist or whatever, that's horrible. But for the most part, most people are mocking them for those reasons, for having poor motivations, a poor understanding of the subculture they're trying to exploit, and a poor understanding of leftist values and feminism in general. Their work isn't intersectional. It is not nearly as edgy as they think it is, and it's frankly shameful to, like I said, the people who came before them. So I hope that this kind of contextualizes why people are so upset with the Tramp Stamps, or why I'm personally so upset with the Tramp Stamps. I've seen what the punk subculture looks like at its best and brightest, and it does not look like them. And it does not espouse the values that they espouse. It is far more radical, far more inclusive, and far cooler, frankly, than what they are doing. Hopefully this brought you some insight. If you enjoyed this content, let me know so that I can produce more content like it. And if you ever felt like making music, now's the time to do it. We're all stuck at home anyway, so peace.